I really like all of your. Is today Decade Day? Is that what it is? Okay, I walked in, I saw all these outfits, and I was like, it must be something. You all look great. So recently, I've been watching Making a Murderer on Netflix. Do you guys know of this show, Making a Murderer? Right? Okay, it's really intense. My husband actually finds it really annoying because I started midway through the second season, and now I don't let him watch it without me. First of all, mostly because I'm just a scaredy cat and I need someone next to me to watch it with. And second, because, actually that's really just it. I'm just a scaredy cat. But anyways, so this show, Making a Murderer, for those of you who don't know, is this true life documentary series about the case of this man, Stephen Avery. And he was a Wisconsin man who was wrongfully accused of assaulting someone and then spent 18 years in prison before he was cleared of the crime through DNA testing. And then when he got out of prison and he started to bring attention to all the ways in which the county sheriff department had hidden evidence in his case, he suddenly gets accused of murder. And then he spent and continues to spend more than a decade in prison, insisting again that he's been framed. And so the show is about these lawyers who they act like detectives uncovering these different details in his case. And it's about showing us how our justice system can sometimes lead to injustice. And so I'm not sharing all of this with you in order to talk about the merits or the demerits of the justice system or to get you to really watch this show, although I know that's what it sounds like right now. But I'm sharing it because something that drives me nuts when I'm watching it, what makes me want to reach into the screen and shake someone, is one side's refusal to hear the other side. There's this insistence on the part of Stephen Avery's accusers and the other side's lawyers that there's one point of view and it's the right one. And there's this attitude that my truth is the only truth, that people can't possibly have been wrong. And this drives me nuts. That people think that their way of seeing things is the only way of seeing things, and that they purposely avoid or dismiss anything to the contrary that could possibly change their way of thinking. And I see this everywhere. I see this with my mom when I have a different perspective than her. I see this with myself when I have a certain view of something and I don't get why someone else would think otherwise. I see it with liberals and with conservatives in our current political climate. All sides are guilty of this. Too often, liberals like to sit on their high horses and look down their noses at people who don't hold the same progressive views as them. And folks on the more conservative side like to paint progressives as these crazy socialist hippies who want a world without any structure or rules, and they just have way too many feelings about everything. And so we do this politically. We do this with, say, that person in your class that you can't stand, with our siblings when they're driving us nuts, with our parents, with our partners. We turn each other into cartoon characters, into one-dimensional beings, and we see and we hear and we interact with one another through those lenses. You've done this, right? Raise your hand if you've done this. Yeah? Me too. We all do this. We tell ourselves these stories about one another, and then we hold really tight to those stories that we tell about one another without really examining them, without thinking about where they come from or why. For example, totally made up example, say that I think a student in one of my classes is being disruptive or rude. Maybe she never does her homework. And so I've decided in my head that she's lazy, she doesn't care, she's just disrespectful. And say I find out a little later that actually she's having trouble at home. Maybe her parents are splitting up, maybe a sibling of hers is having health issues. Suddenly, my cartoon character version of her falls flat, right? It has the air completely sucked out of it, and the story that I have no longer holds true. So what would happen if we didn't do this, if we didn't cling so tightly to our stories? What if we could admit that maybe we don't know the whole story? that we don't know whether we're right or wrong. I think that it would maybe make us feel anxious because it would open us up to changing, to possibly having to rethink our beliefs, and that could change our sense of who we are as people. But I think that that anxiety, that fear of the unknown, is what keeps us in this realm of certainty, of wanting to claim things, to stick to our stories, even if we don't fully know if they're true. So I'm not saying that this means we no longer stand by our convictions or give up our values. Of course not. What I'm saying is that maybe we should stop holding on to them for dear life, that we no longer use them as a shield against that which makes us uncomfortable. How do we learn if we don't risk being uncomfortable, if we don't invite differences? And even more than invite those differences, actually engage them. Learn about what life experiences, what fears, what insecurities shape people's beliefs and actions, and rather than shut them down or shame them or belittle them, we could, as Alice Walker said in her poem that Sarah read, we could sit with people. We could notice the texture of their clothes. We could learn to speak in a different language, a language that isn't about dominating, that isn't about proving a point. So what does it do to us to make such a choice? I have a little story for you. When I was growing up in California, there were a lot of Jehovah's Witnesses that would come to our house. My sister and I would look out the windows of our bedrooms and we'd see them coming up the street in their black suits on a weekend morning, and we'd yell, "The church people are coming!" And then we'd get really quiet and we wouldn't open the door, or we'd peek through the blinds as they stood on our doorstep until they went away. And that's what my concept of Christianity was for a really long time. It was people who try to convert you, which frankly, I found really offensive. The message that it sent to me was, you're not good enough as you are in your Hindu or not Christian ways. In order to be good or accepted, you would have to be a certain way, and that's my way. And then when I went off to college, this kind of notion of Christianity in my head continued when, one, my college boyfriend told me that technically I would go to hell because I wasn't a Christian like him. And two, when a friend of mine who was involved in a Christian group asked me if I wanted to talk about God, and I said, sure. And then I soon enough realized that this wasn't actually a conversation, it was an attempted conversion. And so I got out of there real quick. And so, when in divinity school, this white Christian pastor in training guy asked me out, I was like, think again, man. This is not happening. In fact, when he asked me out, I said to him, and I quote, "I am never, ever, 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 ever gonna be a pastor's wife, Eric." Well, you all know how that turned out. And in fact, to show you how far my story about people like him who grew up in rural America went, when I first was packing to visit his family in Wisconsin, I actually asked him, "Hey, Eric, does Wisconsin have Wi-Fi?" And he looked at me like I was joking, and unfortunately, I very much was not. So, what happens when we take our preconceptions, our stories about people, the stories that act as these concrete walls that keep certain people out and others in, and we open them to being tested, to seeing whether it is our fears that are true or whether something else is true? So I want to share a few things that I've learned from this Midwestern white Christian dude who grew up in a red state in a town that doesn't even have a post office. That people in rural Wisconsin, even if they may vote differently than he and I do, are not these uneducated, crazy, racist, gun-loving bigots. They're actually really lovely, loving people. The kind that will show up for you when you're sick, that know and care about their neighbors, that stay connected to one another. And I think that's something that those of us sometimes in a lot of these urban coastal areas could actually really learn from. I've learned that the Christianity that he practices and the Hinduism that I was raised in actually have a lot in common. That I've actually become a more spiritual person, more grounded in the traditions that I was raised in since being in a relationship with someone who has a different faith than my own. And I think our conversations actually deepen my own understanding about what I believe and what I don't. I've also learned that just because someone's into Jesus doesn't necessarily mean they're trying to convert you. In fact, Jesus was actually kind of a cool, radical, social justice-y dude. And that Wisconsin does have Wi-Fi, as I learned when I got there. And so what happens to us when we open our stories to being changed is that it actually transforms us. It expands us and our abilities to be human and to see other people as human too. And that, I think, is something that our world is in dire need of. I have one last story for you. Many of you have heard of the song Kumbaya. And in the past few decades, that song has really been mocked. You know, people are like, oh, are we gonna hold hands and sing Kumbaya? Great, you know? It's become this shorthand for mocking people coming together in the midst of their differences. This making fun of people compromising or not holding so tight to their stories or to their truths. This is one of those many things that also drives me nuts, because when people say, oh, we're not gonna hold hands and sing Kumbaya, that's so dumb. First of all, like, why the heck not? That sounds great to me. And two, most likely, if you're saying that, you don't actually necessarily know that the song has a really long and powerful history. The song Kumbaya comes from the Gullah Geechee tribe, whose ancestors came to America as slaves from West Africa. And in the Creole accent, the words "come by here" sound like kumbaya. And the song was sung then and has been sung since throughout slavery, through the civil rights movement, as this spiritual plea of an oppressed people asking for divine intervention, for justice to come their way. And I was listening to this interview with Vincent Harding, who was a major part of the civil rights movement in the US, and he was a close friend of the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. And this part of it, when he talks about young people's efforts during the summer of 1964 to help Black folks in Mississippi whose votes were being historically suppressed, to help them register to vote, really struck me. I'm wondering, are you all playing it in the back, or am I reading it?
My mind goes back to the Mississippi summer experience, where the movement folks in Mississippi were inviting co-workers to come from all over the country, especially student types, to come and help in the process of voter registration and freedom school teaching and taking great risks on behalf of the transformation of that state and of this nation. And there were 2 weeks of orientation. The first week was the week in which Shrestha and Goodman and their beloved brother, Jimmy, were there. And it was during the time that they had left the campus that they were first arrested, then released, and then murdered. And the word came back to us at the orientation that the three of them had not been heard from. And Bob Moses, the magnificent leader of so much of the work in Mississippi, got up and told these hundreds of predominantly white young people that if any of them felt that at this point they needed to return home or to their schools, we would not think less of them at all, but would be grateful to them for how far they had come. But he said, let's take a couple of hours just for people to spend time talking on the phone with parents or whoever to try to make this decision and make it now. And what I found as I moved around among the small groups that began to gather together to help each other was that in group after group, people were singing, Kumbaya, come by here, my Lord. Somebody's missing, Lord. Come by here. We all need you, Lord. Come by here. And I could never laugh at kumbaya moments after that, because I saw then that almost no one went home from there. They were going to continue on the path that they had committed themselves to. And a great part of the reason why they were able to do that was because of the strength and the power and the commitment that had been gained through that experience of just singing together, Kumbaya.
I'm Krista Tippett, and this is On Being. Today, we're
So we can come together across difference. We can create something in the midst of difference. We can even be transformed by one another's differences if we allow ourselves to be. Thank you.